So we were slightly delayed here because people are still drinking coffee, but that wouldn't hold us back. There's a Turkish saying, the dogs are barking, but the caravan is still moving. We just keep trucking. So my name is John Calvert. I'm a research scientist at Army Cyber Institute. I'm going to moderate this. We have a very straightforward model, 25 minutes for each paper. Within that, we're going to have questions for each paper. And to save time, I'm going to have a short introduction of Captain Eric Korn and Jason Healy. They're going to be our first presenters. Stage is yours.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Captain Eric Korn, research scientist with the Army Cyber Institute, along with...
Hi, Jay Healy, senior research scholar at Columbia University, CIPA.
Yeah, and we're really excited to have the privilege to talk to you today about the defense support to the private sector concept. Thank you for providing us with this opportunity to discuss and present ideas for how DoD can work towards the realization of Defend the Nation mission in cyberspace. I know it's been said once or twice before already. We'll say it one more time. These are the views of the author. They're our own, do not reflect the views of the Army Cyber Institute, United States Military Academy, United States Army, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Okay, so for our presentation, our paper presentation today acknowledges that the traditional defense support to civil authorities is a useful framework for many types of emergencies and disaster response efforts. However, the Dsca framework remains limited when assessing how DoD can best ensure the Defend the Nation mission is accomplished in cyberspace. And with the private sector regarded as critically important for ensuring adequate defense of the nation in cyberspace, we believe it's positioned on the front lines of this domain, and it distinguishes therein as a main effort that DoD can help directly support with its assets and resources during a national cyber emergency. So first, we're going to provide a very brief overview of Dsca and the traditional pillars of DoD support. We'll next present our 4 additional mechanisms that can further bolster defense support to the private sector, and then we'll follow those with 4 corresponding recommendations for further exploration going forward. So traditional defense support to civil authorities, Traditional defense support of civil authorities is a well-established framework that's been regularly exercised during national emergencies. And for those not familiar with defense support to civil authorities, we'll just briefly discuss some of the main points of this traditional framework. So when a significant emergency event, such as a hurricane, occurs in one state or multiple states, the Stafford Act allows the presidential declaration of an emergency or a major disaster to ensure the allocation of critical federal resources that support multiple response efforts. And this could be state-to-state emergency aid systems, immediate availability of state National Guard at the direction of that state governor, and also FEMA financial support. On the federal level, the president will typically take primary agency to coordinate the federal response, and that is in correspondence with the National Response Framework and specified emergency support functions that correspond to specific agency or departments with their own coordinator that performs as the federal coordinating officer. And where DoD plays a significant role in those response efforts, each of the 10 FEMA regions maintain a defense coordinating officer that works directly with that federal coordinating officer as the lead agency or the department. And typically this support is provided for life-saving efforts and in mitigating significant property damage. Additionally, DoD can also provide direct support to federal departments and agencies. So during these Dsca operations, the military typically assumes a supporting role that is subordinate to the designated lead federal department or agency through a multitude of traditional pillars, which we'll discuss next. So despite having a strong Dsca framework, disagreements remain regarding the most effective methods for homeland defense in cyberspace and how DoD should go beyond the traditional Dsca mechanisms during cyber incidents and emergencies. So during cyber incident response, you have traditional forms of DoD cyber support that have included information sharing collaboration, post-incident support, you have shooting back, and also monitoring or direct response. For the information sharing and collaboration has mainly been related to sharing threats and vulnerabilities with the private sector and other government agencies, and that is typically with the private sector and other government agencies to reduce them before they occur. However, the focus here has mainly been on threat reduction before an event rather than the response efforts, which is what we're focused on for this paper. For post-incident support, this support takes place after a cyber intrusion has already occurred with the private sector, and typically those are owners of critical infrastructure, where DoD resources and assets are designated to support other federal departments and agencies. And this has been seen with FBI cyber action teams that are located at all the field offices, as well as the DHS flyaway teams that maintain a Homeland Security nexus. The DoD has been called to assist those other departments in the past. For shooting back, there's the traditional support method that relates to unique authorities maintained by the DoD that allow, when directed, the execution of cyber operations to counter an imminent or ongoing threat in cyberspace. And such an order has rarely been given in the past, even though these attacks have been attributed to nation-state adversaries, such as a 2012 DDoS attack by Iran against the U.S. financial sector. And then lastly, monitoring and direct response. There is joint cyber doctrine that presents the possibility of national-level cyber protection team support to non-DoD mission partners or critical infrastructure networks at the order of the Secretary of Defense. But despite some limitations, it has become the default assumption that sometimes the military cyber defenders will need control of the entire private sector system to have an effect. And we're going to talk a little bit about that challenge going forward.
Can I just highlight on that? It really, and you hear this pop up sometimes of the military saying, well, we should be able to monitor, like if we're going to have to defend the finance sector, we're going to need our own monitoring assets on those computers within the finance sector. And that's the kind of thing that we're bringing out here. How can we defend the finance sector if we don't have the common operational picture, right? And that's kind of what that's part of what General Stewart referred to yesterday. Oh, hey, that's me. Okay, so now I have the laser. And so we wanted to expand out from that, right? It's difficult for us to get from this traditional DCSA framework and these four traditional areas. So, Cyber Command and DoD has been saying, well, what does that mean for defending the nation in cyberspace? It's difficult to get from there to any really satisfactory answers, I think, on defend the nation. Just because of these differences, including, I think one of the big differences, we note that the private sector owns 80 or 90% of the infrastructure, but it's actually the private sector that makes 80 or 90% of the key critical decisions during incidents to respond. And so, right, this puts us in this very, very different area, not that just that they own it, but they are critical to incident response. In fact, I challenge you to find too many incidents that have been decisively resolved by any government, unless it was the government that was the victim. It is almost always the private sector that has that decisive role. And so when we're trying to take these existing authorities and say, well, what if it were a little bit worse? What if a little bit worse? Many of us have driven in a fog. I'm from Manhattan now. Most of those folks haven't driven. But, and when you're in a fog, you can turn on your high beams, and all you can see is more fog. So what we argue in the paper is arguing black and white. We imagine, even as a thought exercise, we are now in, no kidding, a real cyber war. The American people, the president, are not looking to DHS. They are looking to the American military, which is there to protect us. Because then a lot of the authorities go a lot easier. And then you can say, all right, what does defending the nation look like there in black and white? When you have clarity. And then you can work your way down and say, well, what if it's a little foggier? What if it's a little foggier? What's a little foggier? And you can kind of meet in the middle, and maybe that's going to help us come up with some answers. And in general, in most of these, the private sector is the supported command, not the supporting command. Right? And that's different than what General Stewart said yesterday, right? For General Stewart, the Cyber Command was the primary actor in this space, and they would be handing out things to the private sector. So we looked at these other mechanisms for DoD support.
And so we kind of asked ourselves the question, what can DoD and Cyber Command do to help win this cyber thought experiment? There are several different mechanisms that can enable expansion of DoD's Defend the Nation mission in cyberspace. And the four mechanisms that we're going to talk a little bit about and highlight are private sector call for fire, coordination of a multi-stakeholder defensive actions, response support forces, and private sector access to the entire intelligence cycle. In each case, these measures are not just useful for high-end cyber warfare, but also as we go down into those gray zones of conflicts for today.
Oh, that was me? Oh, I thought that was you. Okay. So, in one of those areas, if we're imagining this black and white of real cyber war, imagine you are the finance sector, and you are being attacked by an adversary, say Iran, since they've done it before. And they are attacking critical finance sector infrastructure. And if that attack is not stopped by 5 p.m., then the finance sector is not going to be able to close today, and the cascading effects of that are going to affect the market for 3 weeks to come. How in that situation does the finance sector do a call for fire? This is the FIBA. These are like the troops that are on the forward edge of the battle area that are under fire from an adversary nation. How can we make sure that request gets passed for fire? It's easier. I use finance because they have a lot of clearances. There are a lot of veterans there, including from DoD, FBI, and other places, and they have a full governance structure, right? You're not relying on some bunch of yahoos that are here, right? They've got a governance structure with serious adults in that room that know what they're asking for and know what they need.
Yeah, and so for the multi-stakeholder defensive coordination, currently DHS's National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, known as the NCIC, is the central point for everyday state cyber emergencies. So, however, during a high-end conflict, there are some limitations there that may come to the fringe as the situation continues to escalate. And the NCIC maintains some issues related to scalability, network visibility, classification restrictions, as well as some other touch points with actual private sector defense and trust groups, such as the NSPSEC, ICASI, and the Cyber Threat Alliance that the private sector maintains on a regular basis. So with the private sector owning and operating much of the nation's critical infrastructure, there is a lack of a clear coordination system that remains in the event of a true cyber war. And Professor Hilly's going to talk a little about the doubting system here.
Yeah, right. So think about, and I'm going to keep putting it back to General Stewart's comment, because it was so information-rich what he talked about. Why, at the end of the day, or does that common operating picture that the General talked about, what is gained by having that owned by the military, and what it is gained by having it actually maybe in the private sector, right? If you're going to have that defensive coordination, and you see this massive attack coming, at the end of the day, DoD can't do much about it except shoot at it. Whereas if you've got, at that coordination center, you've got AT&T, you've got the Cyber Threat Alliance, you've got McAfee, you've got Microsoft, they actually have buttons that are connected to the internet, and they can actually coordinate, right? So the answer might not be NCIC, because again, if this is high-end warfare, and so, look, I'm in the Air Force, right? We had a doubting system of where this coordination is going to happen. Maybe this is going to be military, but maybe it doesn't need to be military, especially at that high end. If it's military, it's going to be heavily a significant amount of classification and other issues, and frankly, folks that don't understand the large networks, it's at least something to think about.
And so for the sector-wide response forces, again, this is another concept that we're looking at, a mechanism, and the example here is really organizational depth and support that the DoD could provide, potentially in small teams, to help the private sector work through one of these cyber emergencies in terms of their playbooks, keeping track of the details of the response, again, keeping those communications open with these cyber organizations such as Cyber Command. One of the things we'll talk a little bit about later for recommendations is Joint Task Force that maybe could be created. And also, looking at much needed continuity and stability of the process is something that we can build over time.
And if I can say, where this really came from, I've been the vice chairman of the FSISAC. So the main group within finance that was there to respond to incidents. I didn't need JTF-CNO at that time coming in and monitoring my network. I didn't need military folks to help me defend networks. I didn't need them to take shots. What I really needed was a good senior NCO or company-grade officer that could just be there and say, sir, we've got the next call in an hour. We're still waiting for this information from Microsoft. I just need someone that had their act together and that could help us scale better on the finance side. And we don't think about that when we think DoD support to the private sector in this. I just needed someone with their act together. And so what does that change for when we're thinking about, for example, cyber protection teams? Right, thanks.
And then lastly, just moving into the intelligence cycle, getting full access to the entire intelligence cycle. I think it was previously said yesterday that information sharing is very different than intelligence sharing, and obviously there are some challenges there. But cooperation between the federal government and private sector is improving. You have a lot more cleared individuals that are moving into these critical sectors, and also companies that have hired intelligence professionals that have left the service. But we're still a little bit far behind in terms of having a notional cyber war. And companies in key sectors are often only included in the tail end of the intelligence cycle during dissemination, and we have identified that as a shortfall. they receive these tear-line reports of declassified information that are really lacking in substance and depth, and that's a challenge. So with the private sector companies on the forward edge of the battle area, their active engagement during all phases of the intelligence cycle, especially submitting requirements for collection and clarification of analysis as well as getting that feedback, are critical. And this leads us to our recommendations that we would like to...
And if I can say on that, so I had been in 03, you're in the military, no, that's not a lot in the Air Force, at JTF at CNO. And then 2 years later, year and a half later, I'm the vice chairman of the FS-ISAC. So the group that's doing all of this. I had so much more capability to say, here's a threat that I'm worried about. Can the intelligence community please collect on this or clarify the analysis as an 03 than I did as the vice chairman of this group. And it still is largely that way. Now, there are great reasons why it's that way, but we do have to examine this further. Yeah, we'll get to the Q&A when it's Q&A time. Thank you. Yep.
All right, moving into our recommendations.
And maybe we can even put we'll leave these up. So we've got a couple of these. Recognizing the supporting command role. There is an opportunity that we think to go beyond what we think about the Guard and Reserve, in that maybe you could have, for example, a Guard team in Texas Air Force to work with the energy sector. That can be there for liaisons, that can be there to help intelligence requirements, that can be there for the calls for fire, and the rest. And we can maybe look at these purpose-built units that could. We might want to see if most of the action is happening in the private sector, and maybe we need a new JTF, a Joint Forces Headquarters, that's really specialized in working with the private sector. You might even need a new kind of officer. In the Air Force, we had airborne battle staff that were, you had junior officers that were trained to be on the AWACS to know the fight. Maybe we need that kind of thing here, just like we have Civ Mill.
Right, and I'm sorry, and just like we talked about yesterday, the same thing with the Army and what the Army's doing now with the 17 series and the different variants, where you have the Alpha, you have the Bravo, now we're looking at Deltas, which are developers, so there's a lot of room, not only with the Air Force, as Professor Healy was saying, but also the Army is looking at these ways to do this as well.
Yep, so, and we might have these different areas by the different services. Okay, let's Q&A.
Yes, the question here we have until the hour.
Okay, got about seven minutes for Q&A. Thanks for the patience for everyone.
I start.
Yeah, and then Michael's got one on the front.
Time to action. Is this thing unfolding pretty quick?
Oh, can you wait for the mic? Just for the...
Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, as a starter, time to action. Have you thought about, how events unfold and if you actually would be quick enough to move on this? Or, we've seen that with FEMA, major events, even known floodings of the Mississippi, it takes like a week to start the machinery.
Yeah, it's a great point. From my analysis of the history, I did the first history book in the space called of cyber conflict, called A Fierce Domain. Overwhelming, and when we looked at the incidents, that the private sector brought agility, subject matter expertise, and they have their hands deep in cyberspace. One of my colleagues, Mark Sox, that we were at the JTF together, say, look, he went to Verizon, he said, like, we can bend cyberspace if we need to. Right? No, the government's not good at any of those things and probably shouldn't try and recreate it. What the government is good at is massive resources that really can give staying power for a long fight and access to other levers of power, right? You can, the government can arrest folks and stab folks when they need to. And so what we're trying to get at with this, Eric and I, is saying, let's marry these two bits together. Instead of trying to create these new structures for government at stuff that it might not be good at, like agility, the private sector already has this agility. And so where can we try and find these two places? Now, these recommendations, maybe we have it right, maybe we don't have it quite right, but that's the goal of what we're trying to accomplish with this.
Right, and just as we were saying before, we have to kind of think about these new outside-of-the-box ways that we can find this balance between what DoD can bring to bear and support the private sector, who is really on the front lines every day of these cyber intrusions and these events. And so in doing that, it's going to take creative thinking. And again, like Professor Healy said, these may not be exactly right, but we have to start thinking about a different framework other than Dsca, instead of trying to take that framework and place it on the cyber domain, whereas it is vastly different than any other physical domain that the DoD has had to react in.
Hi, Michael Warner. I work at U.S. Cyber Command, and assuming that I'm not arguing with anything that you say here, all these recommendations are fine. Let's adopt them all. What will the reaction be within Congress and the Department of Homeland Security?
Yeah, and normally I'm such a huge supporter of the DHS, right? I mean, if anyone is familiar with my work, I am looking overwhelming to restrain DoD operations and to increase DHE and the strength of DHS and DHS. Oh, and CISA is going to get signed. Woo! Right? And so normally, like, I take that point and I shared the paper with DHS. And so we are going to have to work through that, right? I think on some of these, it's going to be a conversation. Some's already kind of happening with the finance sector in some of the in some of those mechanisms, and I think that's okay as long as we're framing it in this way, and as long as it's kind of bounded on this top end. That's definitely a concern. I'm worried that a particular if you had a particular kind of cyber commander, they're just going to see an open door and they're going to run and they're going to run through it, but the Defend the Nation mission is there, and I think some of this is a little bit better. Like, and it's even in the call for fires, we can include some kind of DHS mechanism that, and Treasury. Like if we're talking about, they're going to want something in that, and so we start the process, and hopefully we can come together on that. Yeah, I think DHS is going to have the bigger issue on the doubting system, right? Because they're going to want NCIC to be the center of everything, and that's going to be something that we work through. Oh my gosh!
Oh, we got one back there.
Earning our chocolates.
Dave Bailey, Army Cyber Command. So, in your analysis, what's the role of the private cybersecurity industry? And so, in previous exercises that we've done, it's through U.S. Cyber Command and others. I guess DHS has made the point consistently that, and certainly DoD has to a certain extent as well, is that we don't compete with a private industry that could be capable of responding to these kinds of things. So how do you integrate that kind of response that's probably, from a commercial perspective, their first line of defense, if you will?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing that comes to mind, sir, and we talked a little bit about it, is really the value that National Guard component can bring to the table here, because their everyday job is in this sector and in these IT jobs, and if they are brought to come to bring a new organization with a joint task force, we kind of thought to ourselves, maybe the best capacity or the best individuals to fill that capacity would be these individuals in the National Guard or the Reserve component. To help bridge that gap between the private sector. And I know that Cyber Command has acknowledged that there is absolute value in the Reserve component and the National Guard. It's just trying to see how we can best integrate that expertise and also that link to the private sector to create that balance and have the right formula going forward.
Yeah, and I really see it I agree with that, and I also see it on the multi-stakeholder defensive coordination, right? Because it's mostly the cybersecurity companies that have the bulk of the information, right? We don't need to share information. It's largely there in the companies and places like the Cyber Threat Alliance. They're the ones that, if they make a change, it affects everybody in a way that we just don't have with DoD. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how we can do that coordination so that we can keep our defensive, when we think about defensive command and control, I don't think we think of, well, how are we going to do defensive command and control, including with the private sector cybersecurity companies, but they're actually the ones that makes just a huge difference. I think places like the Cyber Threat Alliance and ICASI are some great places to look at.
All right, you can't walk off yet, because I have a very quick question that requires a quick answer. So with the Great Mississippi, we know the water getting higher and higher in Keokuk, Iowa. We can see it coming down. We know participation, the rainfall, everything. We know it's coming. So we reach a threshold that we know this trigger all these mechanisms. What would be a threshold here to trigger all these mechanisms?
So, in trying to walk back to, and that's what really the challenge is, and we talking about Professor Healy's concept of the black and white concept. So these are very gray areas, and I think it applies to the same thing when you're looking for thresholds. And those can be different thresholds for different entities for different countries, and I think that going forward, we have to see what, using this black and white experiment, what can we identify? And as Professor Haley said, moving down into the fog and identifying those things that will help us identify those thresholds.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the political answer is whenever the president says. The actual answer is if you say, imagine we just called like a NATO Article 5, or imagine that a president just authorized kinetic force in response to a cyber attack, you're talking about death. In most of the circumstances, you're talking about a smoking hole in the ground. You're talking about a significant number of deaths.
All right, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You're going to get your chocolate box later. It's called delayed gratification.
All right, go ahead.
All right, Mike Warner. Oh, you, Fish Keller. Man. Next up, Mike Fishkeller from Institute for Defense Analysis.
Except I'm going to be down because the lights are just too strong for me. Slides. Thank you. This is going to be maybe a little bit controversial. I say that because that's what one of the reviewers of the paper said. And so I want to thank actually the reviewers, and Ed Sobieski in particular. I don't know if Ed's in this room, but he showed a lot of patience in multiple iterations of both these slides and the paper itself. This is a piece that I've written with Richard Harknett. Richard and I have done a lot together. We started working together about 2 years ago when Richard was in the CAG at Cybercom and I was in the J5, and now I'm working for the CAG and Richard's back at Cincinnati, but we still collaborate. And we have basically developed the theory behind the strategy of persistent engagement. So this is going to be a little bit of theory, but it's going to be a theory on the strategic competitive space that CyCON was about this time around. So, AA. Not. AA. There we go. All right, quick outline. Central challenge. I'm going to go through this very quickly. In fact, I'm going to go through the slides quickly. There's a lot of words, but the slides build, so you'll be able to digest them. And if I go along, Mike Warner has already offered me some of his time. Thank you, Michael. I'm going to talk about the emergent revisionist ways and means. How do we conceptualize the cyber strategic environment and characterize its dominant strategic dynamic? I'm going to look at two possibilities. Is it a space that's characterized by conflict and escalation, or is it one characterized by agreed competition and competitive interaction? You can pretty much guess which one I'm going to land on. And then I'm going to talk about strategy of persistent engagement. It's come up a little bit here today. I wasn't able to be here yesterday, but I'm glad I'm able to talk about it today since we kind of developed it and we can offer some clarification on what it is and what it's about. And then finish with how do we reorient for two strategic spaces. All right, traditional and emergent revisionist ways and means. Why are we here today? What has cyberspace done to change the world as we know it, certainly from a security studies perspective? Traditionally, states have always had the strategic objective of securing or advancing their own or degrading, usurping, or circumventing other sources of national power. Direct revision of overall distribution of power has historically required territorially focused, episodic, overt, violent, armed invasions and attacks using military forces. This is the traditional Clausewitzian notion of war and strategic conflict. And in fact, we have existing legal regimes that are built around this traditional way of achieving strategic advantage. UN Articles 2 and 4, they talk about the use of force, and they talk about armed attack as the justification for self-defense. So we call this the strategic space of armed conflict. Fair enough, right? Now, what's interesting about what I witnessed today is, even though CyCON is supposed to be talking about competition, I saw a lot of people talking about this. Now, that is indicative to me of the struggle that our community is having in shifting their perspective from the space of armed conflict to the strategic space of competition. Just a little observation on my part. So let's talk about that second space. Cyberspace and cyber operations have introduced new ways and means of achieving the same objective. We have sources of national power focus, continuous strategic campaigns comprised of often covert cyber ops, short of armed attack. We see economic and military power being degraded through IP loss. We see social cohesion and military power being degraded through cyber-enabled information operations. We see military power being degraded through sanctions circumvention. And so that's the DPRK basically undermining SWIFT to support their nuclear enterprise. These new ways and means actually exploit existing legal regimes. And by that I mean Article 2, 4, and 51, which are based on use of force, right? Because these are achievable. This strategic advantage is achievable by not ever crossing the threshold of use of force. We call this the strategic competitive space short of armed conflict. That is where we think the game is in cyber. We think it is the dominant space in cyber. The strategy that addresses it should be the dominant U.S. strategy for cyber. I'm not saying deterrence is irrelevant. I'm just saying this is where the action is, right? And it's strategic, just as strategic as the deterrence space. Adversaries adapted to this new strategic environment years ago. The Russians, the Chinese, DPRK, Iran. We just now got around to it. All right, so the national security strategy, national defense strategy, the DoD cyber strategy, for the first time, talked about this strategic competition below the threshold of armed conflict. This was a sea change in strategic guidance this year. Right, so we just got to it. Our adversaries have already been in there for about a decade. Right, it's important that we got to it. You'll notice the one document that isn't up there, which is the White House strategy, cyber strategy, because they haven't gotten it yet. Right? I think they think it, but they didn't talk about strategic competition in the White House cyber strategy. They still talked about deterrence in the space of armed conflict. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? The strategic question and our proposed answer. How do we conceptualize the cyber strategic environment in order to characterize its dominant strategic dynamic and inform the development of strategy, policy, campaign plans, and so on and so forth? Because we have to. We have to understand what it is before we can begin to describe or discuss or think about what the strategy should be, and then everything that should flow from strategy that follows. Here's, because I'm used to briefing military folks, this is basically my bottom line up front. The cyberspace strategic environment is an agreed competition. I have that italicized because it's a term that we borrowed from Herman Kahn. Dominated by a strategic dynamic of competitive interaction short of armed conflict. Strategic success is found in securing and advancing national interests through persistent engagement without resorting to armed attack equivalents. In fact, we take that one step further by saying that you actually engage in cyber operations that generate effects equivalent with armed attack. That's a failure of your strategy, because our theory says the strategy best aligned to the cyberspace strategic environment is one that does not generate effects equivalent with armed attack. Okay, how did we get here? How did we arrive at this conclusion? We started, and by the way, the story I'm about to give you, it didn't go this smoothly. It never does, right? But after the fact, we went back and looked at it and said, oh yeah, this is actually kind of how we got there. But we started with a long-standing analytical framework, the strategic environment of conflict and a strategic dynamic of escalation. And of course, the godfather of this is Herman Kahn in his book On Escalation. Kahn noted that a class of deterrence strategies was one way to gain strategic advantage in conflict by managing escalation dynamics, risks and threats that leverage the potential for eruption to increase levels of violence. Now, in spite of the fact that he used this so that we could gain strategic advantage, so that we could never reach nuclear war, his framework has actually been used in lots of different places. Right? Not just in discussions of nuclear war. It's been used in discussions of conventional conflict. It's been used back to describe what happened in World War I. So the fact that he wrote this under the umbrella of nuclear weapons does not make it irrelevant to anything else. Right? His strategic concepts are still very relevant. At least that's the argument I'm going to make. He described escalation as an increase in the level of conflict in international crisis situations. That's important, his definition of escalation. And it's been used that way by everybody that I've heard today. When they've used that word escalation, in their mind, they've been talking about it from the strategic space of armed conflict, which is good. That shows the enduring, persuading value of this piece of scholarship, right? That's where everybody puts it, and that's good. All right. He introduced 3 mechanisms for escalation whose definitions we've adapted for the cyberspace strategic environment. He talked about widening the area. For him, that was basically increasing the front of the attack, right? So here we're saying it's increasing the number of systems affected through the cyber operation or a campaign. He talked about compounding, which was bringing in allies to help your cause. For here, it's increasing the number of actors whose systems are intentionally utilized or affected or implicated as causing an effect, false flag. So again, bringing in other countries through the campaign. And he talked about intensifying, which was either increasing the frequency of your attacks increasing the severity by increasing the potential bomb damage and so on and so forth. And we basically give it the similar definition for cyberspace. It's doing more of the same. So if you think of a DDoS attack, for example, increasing the frequency of the DDoS attack, reducing the frequency, that's another thing that cyber gives you the ability to do. So we take those three. We took those three. We analyzed open source data. And here's some data from FireEye and Mandiant, but we also looked at CSIS data. The work by Brandon Valeriano and Ryan Maness basically draw the same conclusion that I'm about to present you here. Okay. And here's a bunch of stuff that is widening and compounding, evidence of widening and compounding. Right, I'm going to focus you on healthcare and insurance. In 1 year, there were 6 companies that were hacked for PII, all by China APTs. They started with OPM, they finished with Blue Cross. Right, widening and compounding. Intensifying 2017 Russian DDoS operations against Estonia, increase in frequency every day. That's intensifying. That's consistent with Kahn's definition. Intensifying to escalation, Stuxnet. You can have these slides, by the way. You don't have to take pictures of them. Okay. And then we identified a discordant condition. So because of that data, we've seen a lot of widening. We've seen a lot of compounding. We've seen a lot of intensifying. But we've seen very few instances of escalation. Remember, Kahn described escalation as raising to another level of conflict. Yet there's little doubt that adversaries have, over the last decade, achieved strategic advantage. So they've achieved strategic advantage by widening, compounding, intensifying, not escalating. It's not consistent with Kahn's theory. What's going on? It can actually be explained. Right? In cyberspace, Richard and I have argued that the disincentive to escalate is both structurally and strategically reinforced. Due to the interconnectedness, which is the structural feature of cyberspace, strategic targets are accessible in, through, and from cyberspace via cyber operations short of armed conflict, and strategic objectives are achievable through accumulation of effects from such operations. There's no incentive to escalate. No incentive if you can achieve strategic objectives short of that. So if conflict and escalation is not a useful strategic environment, strategic dynamic pair for understanding cyberspace, what is? Agreed competition and competitive interaction. Where these come from, Kahn also talked about a second class of strategies to gain strategic advantage in conflict, making use of the factors Michael, may I have water, please? Relating to particular levels of escalation. And he called that agreed battle. And these are his quotes. And what's important for you to note is agreed battle is the competitive space between escalation levels. Right? So on his ladder, pick 2 and stay between them, where neither adversary wants to go above, and they're happy to try to achieve strategic advantage within that space. The agreed part rests upon interactions. This is critical. You figure out what is agreed by engaging with one another in that space. Right? You don't sit around and talk about it. You actually engage. Agreed competition, our flip on the term, is the strategic competitive space between operational restraint, and by that I mean doing nothing, not doing a little of something, and generating effects short of armed conflict. Thank you, Michael. Widening the area, compounding, intensifying are all still useful. If we think of them differently, though, we think of them as mechanism for competitive interaction. Not escalation, but competitive interaction within agreed competition. That said, predominantly because when we've seen escalation out of it, it's because people have intensified by causing physical damage. Competitive interaction, we think, is best characterized by this. Fluid behavior. The Penrose stairs is our graphical example of this. So it's not the ladder, the escalation ladder for Kahn. If you pick those 2 rungs, this is what happens between those rungs. Right? But you always stay between the rungs. Okay, do I have time to do this? Okay. All right, so if that's how you characterize the strategic environment of cyberspace, what is that class of strategies that Kahn talked about that is appropriate for that characterization? The strategy of persistent engagement actually populates that class. Persistent engagement is described operationally in the command vision as the combination of seamless resiliency, defending, forward contesting, and countering operations. Those represent supporting competitive interaction across the interconnected battle space to allow the United States to compete more effectively below the level of armed conflict. That means within agreed competition. Right? The core operational objective, therefore, using this framework is to inhibit widening, compounding, and intensification. That's how the analytical framework is helpful for us to understand. Now, I have to do this one because Jay just talked about it, a really great panel, the stability of agreed competition. A quick review. Agreed competition is structurally and strategically reinforced. Structurally because through interconnectedness, states can access national sources of power. They don't have to actually drive tanks across the border. They can do it through cyberspace. And through those operations, they can accumulate strategic effects. That said, if somebody has a dominant advantage in competitive interaction, in the agreed competition, that's leading to a relative change in power, that may incentivize states to actually escalate out of agreed competition and into armed conflict. So the core strategic objectives of persistent engagement, it's important for me to make clear right here. This is not CyberCon talking. This is our work talking, right? You don't see this in the vision. This is our continued theoretical development of this work. Core strategic objectives prevent extended or enduring imbalances. Jay, you actually spoke to this, right? This is not something the military is used to doing. When you see weakness, you're supposed to pounce. Here, when you see weakness, you're supposed to pull back because you want equilibrium within this agreed competition. You want to sustain equilibrium in this strategic competitive space. The other core strategic objective is to support the development of mutual understandings with adversaries of unacceptable behavior in this agreed competition. Richard and I just published a piece in Lawfare on Friday on this, where we talk about how does persistent engagement support the development of norms. It actually does so very well. This is my last slide, and it's my takeaway slide. Here's the way to reconceptualize the cyber strategic environment. Think of it as two strategic spaces. Right, I talked about these at the very beginning. On the right is your traditional strategic space of armed conflict. Within that, you've got militarized crises and war. The dynamic, the strategic dynamic in that space is escalation, as we've always understood it. Right? But now to the left, we've got this entirely new space that has emerged in cyberspace, that space below the level of armed conflict, that we're calling agreed competition, that has a bunch of new actors in it. And the dynamic in that is not the escalation dynamic, it's the competitive interaction dynamic, widening and compounding. Intensification is what may lead to escalation, but you can also walk back. Intensification can go to de-intensification, but it is the mechanism through which you will escalate into conflict if you are going to escalate into conflict. That's why we have it going all the way across and why we have it coming back as well. Okay, that's it. Thank you. I am done.
So we open the floor for questions.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Major Susswitz. I'm from the ACI. I just had a quick question. This is a little bit outside. I'm more of an engineer by education, so if this is a foolish question, I apologize. But for escalation within cyberspace, how did you define that? Did you consider effects that would be basically permanent and irreparable, but only within cyberspace? Things like more recent, mostly from the criminal side, but things like WannaCry or NotPetya that are absolutely destructive to the private sectors that they impact, and are generally, in my experience, used by adversaries at will. But are certainly destructive in nature, although they don't actually result in well, they may result in human death. But you know,
I'm going to have Jay answer the question for me because he did. The president decides, right? I mean, the way that Khan defined it was moving to another level of conflict. So for him, it was more physical damage than there already was. So for us, because agreed competition doesn't include physical damage, if there's an operation that causes physical damage, you have escalated out of agreed competition and into armed conflict.
More questions? Go ahead.
It seems to me a key problem is getting the agreement, that specific level of agreement on what the competition is. Yeah. Because if I remember reading years ago, a PAPE book, it's like about deterrence, and less than 200 people killed is not a war. I mean, isn't it a little messier that makes it very murky?
Well, there's no question that that's a challenge, right? That is the challenge that deterrence adherents have been wrestling with, right? They've been McCain, rest in peace, every year would say for the last 8 years, where's my deterrence strategy? Which was the wrong question, by the way. You should have been asking, where's my security strategy for cyberspace? But inevitably, everybody would come back and we're trying to identify those thresholds, sir. You know, but see, for us, that's kind of the wrong approach. The deterrence people can continue to wrestle with that, but in persistent engagement in the strategic competitive space, because it's populated by interaction between us and our adversaries, the adversaries amongst themselves, so on and so forth, you are going to discover, this is Thomas Schelling, by the way, talking about tacit bargaining, you are going to discover what is acceptable and unacceptable, but only through engagement and only through interaction. And Schelling, you got to read Schelling again about where he talks about limited conflict. Because this is where he talks about it. He says, how do you determine the limits in limited conflict? You don't do it by deciding ahead of time what they're going to be. You figure them out in conflict, what the limits are, right? So we're saying the persistent engagement is the same thing.
Now I got engaged to afterburners. Jason.
Oh, we do have time? You know, it's just awesome. I really love this work. I love that the U.S. strategy has been developed in part by international relations theorists. If as you talk to the Russians and Chinese, are they going to understand what we're talking about here in this agreement? And also, I mean, they certainly think that we were the ones that enforced a lot of this new one, that we were active in this space, you know, with Stuxnet, with CNN, with encouraging the color revolutions, with IT, with what they learned after the Snowden revelations. So they thought that we initiated this space. Does that change your view of the theory at all?
It's an awesome question. So to give a quick context to it, I told Jay early on, I'm participating in a Track 1.5 effort with the Russians and the Chinese. And next week we're meeting in Paris to talk about this space for the first time, the strategic space below armed conflict. So I don't know. I don't know, and I know how to find you, right? So when I come back, I'll share with you the kinds of conversations, because it's going to be instantaneous translation of the Russian and Chinese. So I'll be able to give you some of their feedback.
All right, thank you. So I have one more question.
Real quick, and this kind of piggybacks off what Jay asked, but this seems like it requires us getting much more comfortable with attribution of our own stuff.
Of our own stuff?
Yeah, that we did.
Yes.
So that would be another sea change, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that, you know, forward defense, countering, contesting, there's a lot that you can do that you're not burning a lot of stuff, right? And I think we've learned that over years. So this is not holding the exquisite target at risk and giving that up. That's the strategic space of armed conflict, right? This is countering and contesting malware and you know, attempts at infiltration and things like that. Yeah. All right. I'm gone now, John. Thank you.
There we are. I have a mic on, so all right. Okay. Thank you very much for having me in here today, and I think this is going to fit fairly nicely with Dr. Fischer-Keller's remarks. And if you saw the strategy panel that was just before ours across the hall there, with some of Jay's remarks and Herb Lynn's remarks and Catherine Lotriante's remarks as well. My name is Michael Warner. I'm the command historian of U.S. Cybercom. I got there in 2010. I tell people that I have 3 jobs. My first job is to take notes, watch what goes on, see what's happening in U.S. Cybercom, keep a record of that. My second job, since when I got there, there was no history of our capabilities in cyberspace, our doctrine or organizations, where we come from in cyberspace. I sort of had to start writing that to help myself in my first job. And my third job was to find a history of cyber conflict, because this was 2010. This was before Jay Healy had published his book in 2013, which is a great help, but it wasn't there then. So I had to be sort of the historian of a fleet, who has to be the historian of the U.S. Navy, who has to be the historian of naval conflict. I kind of made it up as I went, and so it was very interesting watching this. And so what I've done, what I've seen, is what I want to try to present a little bit to you today here. I want to sort of fishtail and dovetail with what we're talking about earlier here. A quick disclaimer here: these are my conclusions here. These are not necessarily the conclusions of the U.S. government or any entity of it. And also, these are drawn from a book that I'm writing with a fellow named John Childress, who's now in the Pentagon here. So I want to give him full credit for that as well, for helping to reach some of these conclusions here. So several insights that I've found through my reading, my watching of the debates, and what I've seen here today at CyCON. The first insight is that cyber operations can be strategically trivial in isolation, but they can have strategic consequences. I think we're pretty much agreed on that. Another insight, and I think we can agree on this as well, is that actors wage cyber campaigns. Actors do these things together. They sort of concert what they're doing in working in cyberspace. And if you've seen from what Dr. Fischer-Keller had up on the board here, you can see those campaigns in the level below armed conflict. So these campaigns, and I would say, since I'm an historian, I'm not a theorist, I'm not an IR person, I'm not a political scientist. I like this stuff, it's interesting. I married a political scientist, so I'm in favor of it, but I'm interested in what are the actual trends, what are the facts, where are the footnotes on these things. That's what they teach us in graduate school. That's where I have to go. So what this means is that their campaigns in cyberspace have links to their strategic concerns, obviously. Not a great insight there, but this is crucial for context. These campaigns that we're seeing in cyberspace have links to the strategic concerns of the actors that are involved here. And those strategic concerns mirror and react to one another. We have a dynamic space that we're looking at here. This is the strategic context for cyber stability discussions and for the discussions about escalation and conflict and persistent engagement. So I'm going to look at a little bit of the history here. I'm going to be concentrating on Russia, but you can extend some of these judgments out to some of the other actors that get named in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy as well there. I'm going to do this really fast, but I'm going to mention some dates. I'm going to sort of go to kind of a horseback survey of the last 20 years, because we've been talking about examples that go back about 10 years here, and I want to go back even farther than that. And I want to say that I think that a campaign has started, a conflict has begun that is more diplomatic and international, and it has bled into cyberspace. And this is what we're seeing now. This is part of what we are reacting to now, we in the United States. I would say you would have to go back to the Kosovo War. You would have to go back to the divide between NATO and Russia and the emergence of the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, the idea that states are not fully sovereign in their territory. This Westphalian notion that states are sovereign in their territory. We decided, we in the West, the liberal side of the Atlantic sphere, decided that the way states act in their own territory is subject to the supervision of other states if they cannot maintain order there. This was taken as highly, highly dangerous by a lot of countries in the world. It partly led to the Iraq War in 2003. What comes out of that? You have a couple of countries nuclearize out of that. The North Koreans, the Iranians start heading down the road to nuclear weapons to deter that sort of thing in the future. One country looks at the Iraq War and says, we need to denuclearize. We need to make sure we are off this weapons of mass destruction path. What country is that? That's Libya. And we'll get back to them in a minute here. 2007, you have a real escalation in this conflict here. You have Vladimir Putin sort of throwing down the gauntlet at the Munich Security Conference, saying that he feels threatened. International law does not help countries anymore. It does not protect them. And he needs to guard himself and like-minded countries against these sorts of interventions. This is somewhat academic until 2011. 2011, of course, is the Arab Spring. Now it becomes real for a lot of different countries here. In particular, what happens to Libya? Libya, it's thrown into chaos. The Western powers intervene. Gaddafi is overthrown, and he's ultimately killed. And so, what was Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's reaction to this? She's talking to a CBS reporter when an aide gives her the news, and what does she say? Her first reaction is, "We came, we saw, he died." And this has been played all over Russian television. And you can sort of see this here. Vladimir Putin was very upset over this, over what happened in Libya. A lot of countries sort of looked at this and they said, this is where these color revolutions go. This is the direction of these things here. This sort of social ferment creates chaos, and it is used as an excuse for armed intervention. If you look at what happens after that in Syria, this is exactly what the Russians are trying to prevent. They're trying to prevent something like that happening there. The Russians are thinking very, very hard about this. In 2013, the head of the Russian General Staff, General Gerasimov, goes to the Academy of Military Sciences with what I would call a plea for help. He is explaining how this new mode of warfare works, which is to say that these Western liberal countries get together, they sow social unrest, they cause all sorts of problems behind the lines there, they create a humanitarian crisis, then they find diplomatic cover to intervene. At that point, the game is already lost because the military side of the conflict is the last phase of the conflict, and at that point the battlefront is all the way from the front lines to the capital city there. There is no operational pause, there is no opportunity to counterattack. And General Gerasimov is explaining to his people, well, we figured out how to beat the Wehrmacht in World War II. We don't understand this new method of warfare. We've got to get savvy on this very, very quickly. This is the beginning of the Gerasimov doctrine, which I think is misnamed, but this is what it has been called because there are a number of Western authors who've looked at this and said, well, gee, this is exactly what the Russians did in Ukraine, and this is General Gerasimov's talking point for the intervention in Ukraine in 2014. I haven't read it that way. I think that the Gerasimov is calling for, he is looking for assistance there. Perhaps he gets the assistance faster than he expected there, but I don't see this as his game plan for Ukraine. He's talking about what the West can do to them. What else is happening in this? How does this pertain to cyber? It pertains to cyber because the Russians are extremely concerned over what is happening with the West reaching out to civil society within Russia there. Training activists to use VPNs, training them to go through to avoid surveillance. This, by their terms, is highly escalatory. This is almost existential for these people. They look at this as very much a provocation on the part of the West. And I think Putin was a little bit upset with Hillary Clinton when she bragged about this in her memoir in 2013. She talks about spending $45 million to train civil society activists in this way. She goes to Lithuania and to visit one of these training sessions there. I think he's never forgiven her for this. This is the cyber connection here. This is what I believe that a number of countries look at as being a very dangerous escalation on the part of the West. We do not see it that way. Obviously, we don't see it that way. But I think that people think that the cyber campaign has already begun, that it began in 1999 with the Kosovo invasion, that it escalates with the Arab Spring, and that it is a serious struggle now. So what is the way for people to respond to this? They have responded by trying to defend their borders, not just their physical borders, but their cyber borders as well, their virtual borders as well. This is the Great Firewall. This is Iranian social controls. This is a lot of what goes on in Russia to make sure that Western media does not get to people in Russia there. They've also decided to extend those borders out into cyberspace to where dissidents are, to where opponents are, out in other parts of the world, to reach out to them and to make sure that they understand that they are being watched, that they are being monitored, that they can be reached. If you are a former Russian intelligence official and you're in Salisbury, England, we can reach you as well, or we can reach you in cyberspace as well. And we could probably cite some examples of this. So where do I go with this? Where do I go with this? What I'm seeing here, we had Bob Jervis's name invoked in the last panel here. We have a bit of a security dilemma. We are afraid of escalation. I would say we've already escalated. We have escalated in a way that I think fits with what Mike Fisher-Keller has said about agreed competition, about a ways of competing and contesting with each other in cyberspace where people do not want this to go to armed conflict. They're trying to keep it below that, but nonetheless, they're trying to defend their borders there. They are trying to make sure that these threats do not happen and they do not get another Arab Spring. So with that, I'll stop and take questions, and especially from you guys up here that I think that this fits in with your theory. Yeah, please. Mm-hmm.
So if I was wondering this in the sovereignty panel earlier today,
mm-hmm.
but basically, at which point does the free and open multi-stakeholder government model for the internet that we love so much start to, when do we start to cede some of that territory in order so that they can feel safe within their boundaries and this agreed competition can de-intensify to some degree?
When do I think that?
Is that something? Well, maybe
I think it's already happening.
Yeah, it is already happening. I wonder when we actually I wonder if we will ever have a point where we, as a policy position, state that the multi-stakeholder model works for some but not all.
I think that decision has already been made for some. I think there are countries that have already said that it works for them, that they can join into it, but it doesn't work for other people trying to get into their bits of cyberspace there. And it may well be that we do get something that looks, if you've read 1984, where you've got this 3 states that control the entire world, they might not control it geographically, but they might be controlling the internet portion of it right there. You've got 3 gigantic internets with some pretty strong boundaries between each other.
We'll have the best TV, though. We'll still have the best television.
We'll have Netflix, yes, exactly. We'll have new shows. But I'm an historian. I mostly look backwards, sorry. Please.
If we were to take that step back, would they see it as de-escalatory? Or would they see it as, aha, weakness, let's punch them while they're down?
Jason, they pointed at you twice.
Well, okay, all right. This is a wonderful thought. This is a wonderful thought exercise here. So if we are passive, if we restrain ourselves and we step back, that makes our adversaries more aggressive. If we step forward and we confront our adversaries, that makes them more aggressive. All right? So the answer is yes. Well, what was the question? No, they can't both be true. I don't know exactly where that answer is going to be there. You've got to get to a point where you can say, they are thinking, they do have facts, they do have logic. Let's try to figure out what they're thinking, what they want, and find some common ground. Yeah. Please.
Sorry, I just see in a way I see back to the agreed
non-destructive. The persistent competition for us may be a level of non-destructiveness, but they might define persistent competition as, well, Ukraine is okay for, that's sort of the level of armed conflict, right?
Yeah.
Well, I know, but I'm saying, it's Russian Ukrainians fighting for their freedom. It's an internal conflict. We're not involved. No, I know, but I'm just saying. Right. No, I agree, but I'm saying if they define the agreed competition sort of offset from the way we do.
All right. Okay, we did this in the Cold War. All right, we spent 40 years. The Cold War is 40 years, right? I was only alive for part of it, but these are two mutually exclusive world systems with mutually exclusive visions of history, both of which are scientifically proven, because Marx showed scientifically that it was going to work out this way, that the proletariat was going to win, the bourgeoisie would fade away, the means of production would be here, and so we knew it. It was science. We kind of figured out ways to work with the Soviet Union so that our ships could be near their ships, and our ships could be near their ships, sometimes almost within sight of Crimea during the Cold War, and they would not like that very much. And their aircraft would fly right down the East Coast, and we would not like that very much, but we wouldn't shoot them down, and we wouldn't escalate to nuclear war. We would kind of figure out what are the rules of the game. The Cold War in many ways is not a particularly happy example, but at least it's possible, even with people with diametrically opposed visions of history. Sometimes it's possible. Please.
Well, I was just going to point out that your example of the Cold War, if we use the previous speaker's rung analogy, the upper rung is nuclear war. In the cyber, it's much less. So, it's a big difference there. The boundaries, the limits are completely different that are enclosing the space that the rules are supposed to keep you operating in, right? So, obviously, to go beyond the upper rung during the Cold War, is a tougher decision to make than to just maybe go a little above in this.
We still have nuclear weapons.
I know, but that's multiple rungs above.
We still have some frightening.
Those are at the
power.
top of the ladder, right? Yeah. We're talking about something that's down here much lower on the ladder, right? So,
yeah. Okay.
One quick question.
Please.
That I thought about here. So I once heard old General John Shaw, who was Deputy Secretary in the 80s. But when he was older, he said about People's Liberations Army, well, that's half crowd control. So he
in China.
In China. That all their military, it's big, but it's pretty much just crowd control. And what you're saying now is some sort of that they feel threatened by a cultural invasion. More kids in Manchuria likes to live in California than Californian kids want to live in Manchuria. That this creates a stress on the totalitarian society, that the younger generation, Russians, they don't want to drink vodka and drink patriotic songs. They want to drink vodka but not sing the songs. So could you just mention that quickly as we wrap up?
Well, I think that authoritarian societies in this day and age, with cyberspace pervasive, cyberspace everywhere, with so many ideas and so many different forms of media, I think they feel themselves under siege. I think that they feel themselves on the defensive every single day. That much of what they do in cyberspace, I think they would say is we're just trying to distract our adversaries from this constant 365-day-a-year offensive that they're waging against us. I don't think they make a distinction between Cyber Command and Microsoft and YouTube and Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook and Google and Apple, and I'm going on and on. I think they see it as all one octopus. And they how do they push back against this? How do they keep these guys at least farther away, or at least squabbling with each other, so they're not in their space and threatening the regime, whatever that regime is?
Thank you so much.
Sure thing.
First, logistics. So after this panel, we're going to go across to the main hall and listen to the keynote, the final keynote. And then I would like to thank the panelists.
Well, thank you.
And we conclude the panel.